Live and direct, live and a date no jive.
Legalize it.
Coming how much can a koala bear? Koala bear, koala bear. Koala bear. Barry pulls a joint out of his pocket. Bill says, "Great, Barry, a reefer."
Welcome back to the Karma Koala Podcast and part 3 of our long discussion with Steve DeAngelo and his very adventurous life. We left him at the end of the last episode where he was just with a friend in Mexico who had stuck his finger into a sink that had been broken. What happened next, Steve?
Yes, the broken sink in Mexico. So, there was my friend who had come out with me on the expedition who had gotten plastered, but somehow didn't immediately pass out when he was in his room. And he, at some one point, heard this huge crash and came and knew that something had happened. And so he managed somehow to crawl over the transom. There was this old-fashioned transom window in the hotel to our room. So he climbs in there and he came in to our room, and that's how I found him in the bathroom. He got in there. He couldn't wake any of us up. He didn't know what to do. He found the sink and shattered on the ground, water spurting out all over. So he just did what he could and stuck his thumb in the wall and passed out there. Of course, there was no way then of hiding the expedition from the teachers, and they interrogated all of the kids, and I wouldn't say anything, but the other guys talked about the expedition. And so I had not even touched that sink. I was completely passed out in my room, and everybody else was, and the one guy who could possibly have woken up had his shoes tied to the bed. The teachers found out about it. That didn't deter me from further adventures in Mexico, which we could talk about. It definitely alerted them that there was an issue going on, and it certainly came up when we returned to the United States. I ultimately, the point of the story, then a year later, after getting kicked out of Tacoma Park Junior High School, got kicked out of the Quaker school, which, my parents had really literally, I'd gone to 8 interviews in other schools, something like that. It was their last attempts to get me into a private school, and I was gone from it in a year.
You were about 15 or 16 at this age?
Yeah, I was 14, 15 in that academic year. And I think I had just turned 15 going into Sandy Spring Friends School. No, I didn't. I had just turned 14 going into Sandy Springs Friends School. And so after that, my parents really had no option other than to put me back into the public school system. And I was dropped into a high school called Blair High School, where it was very interesting, right? Because I excelled academically. There was one teacher in particular there who was running a advanced placement English literature class.
Yeah.
And I had a great connection with her. She was one of the people who really had something to offer me. And she was doing the classics. So we were reading Greek mythology, which I was already familiar with from my time in India, reading Greek mythology there. And so I really engaged with her. And she, talked to other teachers who had also, apparently some of them made an attempt to engage with me. There was a teacher there who had come from the San Francisco Bay Area, who was a history teacher. And so she had a very different view of history than I had heard ever before. And it was, more critical of United States development and mainstream culture. And there was a music teacher, Joan Gregorian, and she was teaching us all these hippie songs. So they're
the 3 useful things, aren't they? History, literature, and music. I mean, that's really all you need to learn at school, isn't it?
Yeah, so I was excelling academically, but at the same time, I was, again, selling weed, this time out in an area that they called the Breezeway. And eventually that activity, I got snitched off by other kids who got in trouble. And so that activity came to the attention of the school authorities. They couldn't really kick me out because it was a public school. They kind of had to have me there. They harassed me, and they let me know that they were watching me sell weed. Well, by that time, I was developing some pretty significant connections, and I was beginning to do, more business outside the school than I was doing inside the school with larger quantities of weed. I was making enough money to support myself. So on my 16th birthday, I very proudly went around to all of my teachers and got them to sign the form that they had to sign to allow me to drop out of school. And the teachers were crushed because they could see that I was intelligent and I'd engaged with their classes. I'd engaged with them. I'll never forget the literature teacher. She was so crushed. I looking backwards, I really hate to have disappointed her. She signed that form with the greatest of reluctance. And then she looked at, I guess her anger and disappointment just exploded. And she said, if you do this, you're going to end up on the trash heap. And I said to her, well, yeah, maybe I'll be on the trash heap, but I'm going to be at the top of the trash heap. And so that was my last day of formal education until 10 years later, when I enrolled myself in the University of Maryland.
So what happens next? School's out, not just for summer, but permanently. Give us a little bit of give us a little bit of cultural background around that time. So you're in Washington. Are they Vietnam War demonstrations still going on? Are you involved with those on a regular basis? And I suppose it's also interesting to talk a little bit about, where you were sourcing your weed from, the type of characters that you were dealing with, and a little bit about that sort of subculture around that time for sort of teenagers.
So yes, I was very active in the demonstrations, coming off of my experience in London. I was already searching for the counterculture. I knew this was my tribe. Where is the tribe? And in those days, the tribe gathered in these huge demonstrations. And my parents were, because of their civil rights history, they were not anti-war themselves, but they thought that that being involved with anti-war stuff was somehow it was kind of okay for them. And so I was able to go to some of these demonstrations with their sanctions. And when I got there, I saw people passing cannabis from hand to hand. In those days, people would light joints. You'd be at a concert or a demonstration, they would light a joint and pass it. And then the joint just got passed from person to person. It never came back to the people that lit it up. I saw those joints being passed from hand to hand, and it had a huge impression on me. But, I was still quite young at that time. I guess, when I first started going to the demonstrations, I didn't even have my mustache yet. And so nobody would pass me the joint. And so I was actually going to demonstrations, and I saw weed happening before that Mexican Tea Party. And so as time went on, that was actually, I got into the anti-war movement not long before the end of the Vietnam War, and that movement started ramping down. But in this summer of 1974, just before I had the end of the school year, I had heard rumors that the Yippies were going to have a free concert with Jefferson Airplane on the Mall on the 4th of July. And the background to this is that in 1971, I had gone to a huge, again, it was on the 4th of July in 1971. I had gone to a free concert at a place called P Street Beach, which was a little natural amphitheater in Rock Creek Park in Washington, D.C. And as I was there listening to the concert, the organizers kept on making announcements that the Reverend Carl McIntyre was gathering his people on the National Mall, which was, not far away from where we were. And periodically they would give updates. The McIntyre people now have 1,000 people. They now have 2,000 people. And then they, would announce that, people were departing from the park to go down there. And I think, I don't know, there might have been a ride or a bus or something, but somehow I got from the P Street Beach down to the National Mall. And what I found was it was a counter Vietnam War demonstration that this guy, Reverend Carl McIntyre, was a right-wing Christian preacher, and he was an ally of Richard Nixon. And Nixon and McIntyre had cooked up this idea to counter the anti-war demonstrations and the hippies by having something called Honor America Day on the National Mall. And so McIntyre got all of his people together, who were mostly middle-aged and elderly, and they came out like it was going to be a day in the park. They had their fold-up umbrellas, they had their fold-out lawn chairs, they had their big coolers, and of course all of that stuff was made of plastic, as was their clothes. And they were sitting there on the National Mall, again at a kind of natural amphitheater on the grounds of the Washington Monument. And when I got down there, I saw this, fairly large expanse of McIntyre people in lawn chairs, but right down by their stage, there was this wild group that was just chanting, and I couldn't hear what the chanting was. They're like these wild hippies with hair, and I saw these like clouds of smoke going up, and as I got closer, I could hear that they were chanting, "Fuck, fuck, 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 fuck," just over and over again, completely drowning out the McIntyre people from the stage, and throwing up these huge volumes of smoke. So of course it was another one of these moments where I was like, my tribe.
Yeah.
And I ran down there and was part of closing down the McIntyre demonstration. And then we went over to the reflecting pool and picked up a truck and dumped it into the reflecting pool, all the while smoking copious amounts of weed and just completely fired up with this spirit of defiance and rebellion. And, it was our opportunity to fight back against the machine, and we took it. I later found out, and it wasn't for quite a while, 15 or 20 years. I later found out that was the first smoke-in by the Yippies on the National Mall, and that smoke-in grew to be an annual event. So fast forward here from 1971 to 1974, on one of my last days in high school, I heard this rumor that the Yippies were going to be throwing a free concert, not a smoke-in, but a free concert down on the mall. And so I went down there, and what I found was not a free concert at all. I found a guy who we'll be talking about some more, named Dana Beal. And Dana was in the middle of a crowd of people with a backpack, and he was asking them to come up with leaflets or their hands cupped. And he was pulling weed out of this backpack and putting it into people's hands or onto their leaflets. And by then, of course, I was selling weed. I had an entourage with me of all the people I was selling weed to. Yeah. And we could see that Dana was just about ready to get jumped by some, pretty tough street gangs that also, worked the area. And so we jumped in and we basically saved Dana. And instead of handing out, cups of weed that people could then, go sell or something, we sat down and we all started rolling joints. And we would light the joints and then hand the lit joints to people. And we basically saved that smoking. Dana had come down from New York. There had not been any preparation. There had not been any stage. There hadn't been anything. But Dana still came down, and he showed up, and he had this bag of weed, and he started giving it out to people. And me and my guys just jumped in. We saw something bad was getting ready to happen. We kind of saved the day. And that endeared me to Dana so much that before he left, he fronted me 2 pounds of Jamaican weed that he had not brought to the mall, that were stashed in a house somewhere in DC. That was a incredible experience for me, because I had been wanting to get connected to some revolutionary organization, and so I connected just in this act of serendipity with Dana Beal,
as it always is with these things, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. And Dana was the successor to Abby Hoffman and Barry Rubin, who I had known about and were famous, and the Yippies were famous. And so I made this connection with Dana in this very, bonding kind of way, kind of in the heat of battle. And he fronted me these 2 pounds of weed. Well, the weed was Jamaican weed. And it was a big step up from all of the Mexican weed that I'd been selling up until then. And he gave it to me at a price that was, essentially the same price that I'd been paying for the Mexican. It was a little bit more, but the weed was 2 or 3 times as good as the Mexican weed. And having that weed instantly propelled me from, the rather low
just
level,
some guy to more the guy, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. From a guy to the guy, exactly. And so, we thinking about my evolution as a weed dealer, in the earliest days, my weed dealing career started when I was having that first smoke session, that Mexican tea party. And I was like, well, where's this stuff come from? And they're like, oh, well, we have friends and, you can buy it from them. And I was like, okay, cool. How much does a joint cost? How much does, the next quantity up from that cost? How much does the next quantity up from that cost? And I started doing all these figures in my head and understanding where the margins were. It was already pretty entrepreneurial. And so I walked away from that session, already intending to become a weed dealer. My earliest connections were people who were willing to sell weed to a 13 or 14-year-old kid. So it was usually 16, 17, 18-year-old kids.
Yeah.
And none of them had very good connections. And some of them were dishonest. And so one of the experiences that I had at Blair High School before I left there in 1974 was that by then weed had started to creep into American society, even to these white suburbs, enough that there was a high school football player who normally I would have nothing to do with, but I had sold a little weed to. And one day he came to me and he knew that I was, at that point, probably the biggest weed dealer in the school. And he said, hey, I've got an older brother and my brother's got a load of hash in town. And would you like to buy some? And I was like, yes, of course. And so long story short, he took from me the money for a quarter pound of hash and never gave me the hash.
Yeah. Lesson learned, number one.
Yeah. And so that, that was kind of the trajectory of my weed dealing up until then, was searching for connections that could actually give me some decent weed at a decent price, and having these, really unpleasant experiences. That wasn't the only one. Back then I was just getting to be, I wasn't old enough to drive. My 16th birthday, the birthday that allowed me to leave school, was also the birthday when I could get a driver's license. So in the years leading up to then, there were these innumerable drives that I'd be going. I'd be in somebody's car, and they would be driving, they would be taking me to the connection. I'd have to wait in the car. The weed would come. It wasn't what it was supposed to be. Just all of these kinds of really low level attempts try and find a connection. So when I found Dana and I got that good 2 pounds of Jamaican weed, I was like, okay, I am in. Not only do I have a great weed connection now, but also I'm connected with this revolutionary organization. And I was just ecstatic. And for the next several years into the early 1980s, my life was centered around being a Yippie, being a revolutionary. And so I moved from the sterile white suburbs with the assistance of some older Yippies, where I was able to rent a house in downtown Washington, D.C., which I turned into something that we named the Outlaws Collective, gathered around a collection of runaways and throwaways and odd sorts of people who all gathered together. This house was in one of the parts of Washington, D.C. that had been devastated in the 1968 riots. And it was just barely habitable. And the landlord rented it to us for $75 a month. And this is a place now where it's, that house is gone. There's big office buildings in its place. But in those days, there was this, we had been talking a little. So in those days, this was one of those neighborhoods that hippies were going into that nobody else would go into.
Yeah.
And so for the next few years, I was the leader of a Yippie collective in downtown Washington, D.C.
Did you find yourself going up to New York at all?
Oh yeah. So what happened is, coming out of the 1974 smoke and getting those 2 pounds from Dana, I then was introduced to the Yippies, and the Yippies had a headquarters in New York on the Lower East Side at number 9 Bleecker Street. Again, this neighborhood has been gentrified beyond all recognition now, but in those days it was an edgy neighborhood that other people wouldn't go to. So of course, once I sold the 2 pounds of weed, I had to go pay Dana for it and hopefully get some more weed. So I went up on the train to New York City and went on the subway to Bleecker Street, all of which were huge adventures for me to do on my own, and paid Dana for the weed and got more weed to take back to Washington, D.C., which I did on the train. In those days, you could do that and not get caught, pretty much. And so that was the beginning of my introduction to New York City. And for the next several years, well, for almost the rest of my life until I came to California, I was going up to New York. I was buying weed there, or hash there. There's a lot of hash. And then
so where was the hash coming from in New York?
So this is another very interesting story. It was coming from a variety of sources, but Dana had a relationship with a guy named Tom Forsad, and Tom had been the Yippies had gathered in Miami in 1972 for the Republican National Convention. This was before I was really linked up with them. And Tom Forsad was one of the main leaders that emerged out of that Miami experience. And Tom was running an organization called the Liberation News Service. And this was a news service that provided news stories to all of the underground newspapers across the country. And he later became famous or notorious as the man who founded High Times magazine. And so I remember being at number 9 Bleecker, the very scruffy, very scruffy headquarters of the Yippies, when the first cases of High Times magazine landed on our doors, because Tom wanted Dana to distribute the magazine. And of course, we were all like, it was almost like seeing the internet for the first time. Those times weed was completely underground, and we didn't see anything celebrating it. And so these glossy, beautiful magazines with all of these stories about weed and weed smuggling and beautiful photos of amazing weed and hash landed at Dana's number 9 Bleecker. And
where and look, with a publishing background, the rest of this section has been taken up with asking you questions about this, because where were they looking to distribute? Was it, with your experience, say, when you saw It magazine in London, was it literally selling one-to-one to interested parties, or were there bookshops in New York at that time that would sort of quietly, would they be selling them up the front, or would they be selling them from under the counter?
So they were selling them over the counter in New York. The backstory to this is that at the same time Tom launched High Times magazine, he was also one of the biggest smugglers of weed. He had developed Colombian connections down in his time in Miami. And so at the same time that he was putting together this magazine, he was also bringing in shiploads of Colombian weed right into the harbors of New York City. And so I had this experience. I was not old enough. I was still the young up and rising Yippie, but Tom was busy doing all sorts of stuff. I wasn't so much
grown up stuff.
But the weed that he was smuggling came through Dana's hands to me. And I didn't know that he was smuggling. I mean, I just knew that he was the publisher of High Times magazine, and he had been a Yippie leader, and he was kind of moved on to other things like the magazine by then. But what I did realize after a while was that, I got these amazing weed kind of cannabis that nobody in my circles had. Hash oil that had been smuggled by the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, Thai sticks that had been smuggled into the country, temple balls and Afghani hash, and none of this stuff was available to teenage kids in Washington, D.C.
I presume that was for the party scene of New York, who were older and had money.
It was for anybody that you could sell to safely, because Tom was bringing in ton loads, right? And so I started noticing that around 3 months or 4 months after I had a load of really spectacular weed, High Times magazine featured the same weed in its centerfold for that month. And so I put 2 and 2 together and realized that Tom was the source of the weed that I was getting. I was just like, gee, Tom, could you figure out a way that you could give me the weed at the same time that it appears in the magazine, so that I'd have the magazine to promote my sales?
Well, that's marketing. I mean, I presume he was already on it, but now it's all about timing, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think he really wasn't. His goal was to sell off all of the weed that he smuggled in as quickly as possible. And so I think by the time the magazine came out, because there's this lead time on publishing, even, and back then it was longer because you didn't have a lot of the electronic layout kind of stuff, graphic software that you have now. So the loads would come into New York. And Tom would sell them off as quickly as he could, but he would photograph them for the magazine. And then the magazine would come out whenever it came out. So it wasn't really possible to use the magazine as a marketing tool. I mean, maybe Tom did, maybe he reserved a chunk of the weed, but from my point of view, I didn't get any more of that weed. Once it was featured in the magazine, that load had dried up. I didn't have it. So
I presume, were you taking the magazine down to DC? Because I presume that would have moved as quickly as the other product, wouldn't it?
Well, no, because Dana's relationship with Tom was a little bit. Dana was a problematic character in a number of different ways, and Tom was too. And so their relationship went through ups and downs. But see, Tom had developed relationships with wise guys, with people who were linked into the Italian mafia. Mm-hmm. And the Italian mafia at that time was looking at all these hippies smuggling massive loads of weed into the country, and they wanted to get into the action And so Tom, I believe, I don't know from firsthand experience, but I believe that Tom was working with some of those folks. And they also had relationships with people who controlled magazine distribution, because the mob had gotten into magazine distribution as a front to distribute pornography back when pornography was illegal and you couldn't buy it in stores. So Tom made a deal with the guys who were running the mobbed up magazine distribution company and got them into all of the magazine stands in New York City and even in other places around the country. And so that was Tom's main distribution channel for the magazine. And I think he had ambitions of moving the High Times magazine through the same network of underground hippie newspapers like it, that the Liberation News Service had been servicing. But at that time, and this is another thing that really colored my my development, the Vietnam War was ending. And the period of time when you had this huge counterculture that was, jumping into the mainstream in the US started shrinking. The big demonstrations were no longer happening. And Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman had left the Yippies to go on and do other things. Rubin later wrote a book called Growing Up at 36, where he denounced his Yippie roots. And at the same time, you saw the revolutionary groupings being replaced by the human potential movement, and people like Werner Erhard and Est, and there was this other manifestation where people started getting into a guy called Guru Maharaji.
Yes, we all know about. Yes, we can discuss that in more detail, because he became world famous, not just in the sort of counterculture. I remember as a child reading about him in the National Geographic.
Yeah, so there were all of these, as the anti-war movement died, the counterculture started shrinking massively, and it started, being eaten up by these groups like Werner Erhard and Est and Guru Maharaji. And so, the Yippies went from being the coolest thing at the center of pop culture to being kinds of has-beens. But that was already my tribe. I was already committed. I was like revolution, weed, and free sex forever. It was really kind of traumatizing for me, because I was like, I had all this great weed. I was making all this money. I was running a Yippie collective. And then the counterculture all around me started shrinking. And at the same time, my relationship with Dana was running into the same kinds of problems that everybody who had relationships with Dana ran into. Looking backwards, I think that he was really struggling with, deep trauma and depression. He had been locked up in a mental institution and given mental institution drugs as a young man when he was a rebel. And I think that experience was still really sticking with him. And he was also he was a hustler, but not a very good hustler. Mm-hmm. So, he would want to do a smoking, but he didn't have it together to get a permit for a concert and put up a stage and get banned. So he just showed up in Washington, D.C. with a bag full of weed. And he didn't really have it together to, take Tom's amazing, excellent weed and transport it out of New York City himself. So he depended on kids like me who would come up there and get weed from him. And he gave us no tutoring, no instruction. I never got okay, you're going to be carrying weed on the train. You need to dress carefully. Make sure that you don't smell of weed when you go on the train. All these basic kinds of things. I never got that education from Dana. It was just here's a bag of weed and I'll see you later. And so I had to figure out all of that stuff on my own. So one of the things that happened, reflective of Dana's approach to just sending unprepared kids out on the road, was that I had a load that I owed him money for, and he needed to pay somebody for the load. And he was like, I was in DC, and he was like, just get the money to me as fast as you can. I was like, well, it's going to take me, an hour or two to get to the train, and the train is 4 hours, and there's the last train for the day has left already, or something like that. And he's like, well, take the plane. So I did. I went to the airport. I had a suitcase full of money. I had some stash with me because I never went anywhere without my weed and my hash. And I get to the airport, and it was just after the DB Cooper hijacking, which was the first hijacking in the United States. And it was the first time that they put searching machines up at the airport. So I go to the gate to get onto the airplane, and I see this machine. I'd never seen one of these machines before, but they had a sign up that said, we're going to search, we're going to put your machine through the bag. If the machine alerts, you'll have a choice of either leaving and not going on the plane, or getting on, or letting us search your bag. And I was like, okay, cool. Dana really needs me to come do this. The worst thing that's going to happen is the bag's going to alert, and they're going to tell me that I can't get on the plane, and I'll leave. Well, the bag alerted. They did not allow me to leave. They called the DE agent, who was already there, resident in the airport, and he grabbed me. And that was my first significant bust for cannabis.
Well, that's an excellent way to finish this episode.
Live and direct, live and I ain't no jive.
Legalize it. So how much can a koala bear? Koala bear, koala bear. Koala bear. Barry pulls a joint out of his pocket. Bill says, great, Barry, a reefer.